The world doesn't crucify liars. It crucifies the honest. The ones who don't pretend. The ones who don't posture. The ones who stand in front of a culture built on games and refuse to play. They get laughed at. He was kind when others were cruel. Honest in a room full of masks. He gave without keeping score. He forgave what others couldn't. And so they called him a fool. But what if they were wrong? What if he was the only one awake? Fyodor Dostoevsky knew the cost of seeing clearly. He didn't write to entertain, he wrote to expose. And one of the things he exposed most ruthlessly was this, that in a society obsessed with intellect, performance, and control, humility starts to look like insanity. That's what he gave us in The Idiot, a character so pure, so guileless, so impossibly sincere, that no one knows what to do with him. Prince Myshkin walks into a world built on ego and calculation and brings with him something no one asked for, grace. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't play roles. He doesn't climb over others. Instead, he listens. He offers. He stays soft. And so the world laughs. Dostoevsky wasn't laughing. He was asking the most uncomfortable question of all. What if we've been calling the wrong people fools? Because we've seen this before. In classrooms, at family dinners, in meetings. The one who speaks gently gets ignored. The one who dares to love gets mocked. The one who refuses to join the cruelty becomes the target of it. But here's the secret Dostoevsky knew. Sometimes the people the world ridicules are the only ones not wearing a mask. He once wrote, "It is better to be with God and be wrong in the eyes of the world than to be with the world and be wrong in the eyes of God. To be a fool in the eyes of society might be the highest form of clarity." This isn't about stupidity. It's about spiritual naivete, the kind that isn't naive at all, the kind that chooses love over logic, the kind that walks into the fire and doesn't flinch, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. So let's stop and ask the question no one wants to answer. What if the fool is the only one who actually understands what matters? And even more dangerous, what if the fool is who we were before the world taught us to be afraid? The mind can become a prison. Dostoevsky knew that too well. He'd lived it, overthought it, barely survived it. He once stood in front of a firing squad, seconds from death, and suddenly saw life not as an idea, but as a miracle. Later he wrote to his brother, "I will be reborn for good. I will rise again with a new form." Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every minute could be an eternity of happiness. But before that rebirth, he lived in the shadows of overthinking, something he captured perfectly in Notes from Underground. There he gave us a man who knows too much, who analyzes everything, who sees every motive, every angle, every contradiction, and as a result, does nothing. He is paralyzed by his own awareness. He mocks himself, then mocks the world, then spirals into the kind of despair that only hyperintelligence can create. And then he says it, the line that cuts deeper the more you sit with it. An intelligent man cannot become anything seriously. It is only the fool who becomes anything. Because when everything is debatable, nothing feels real. When every action has 1,000 possible outcomes, none of them feel worth taking. This isn't intelligence. It's collapse. And yet, this is the ideal our culture holds up. The sharp mind, the clever critic, the one who always sees through everything. But what's on the other side of that? Disconnection, exhaustion, a heart too shielded to feel. Dostoevsky didn't want to glorify the fool as clueless. He wanted to show that there is a kind of foolishness that is wiser than all our sophistication, a kind that leads to action, not paralysis, a kind that leads to love, not calculation, a kind that says, I don't need to have every answer, I just need to show up as I am. We've been told that clarity means control, that knowledge makes us safe. But Dostoevsky points to something far more difficult and far more liberating. Let go of the obsession with understanding everything. Because the truth doesn't always arrive through analysis. Sometimes it arrives through surrender, through humility, through a foolish kind of faith. And that kind of fool, he may look absurd to the world, but he's the only one still willing to move forward. There's a fire backstage. A clown runs out to warn the audience. They laugh. They think it's part of the act. He shouts louder. They clap harder. The fire spreads. The clown pleads. The audience roars with laughter, and the theater burns to the ground. That story didn't come from Dostoevsky. It came from Kierkegaard. But Dostoevsky would have nodded, because that clown, he is Prince Myshkin. He is Ivan the Fool. He is Zosima. He is Christ. He is everyone who's ever told the truth without wearing the costume people expected to come in. Dostoevsky wrote in a world that demanded elegance and intellect, but what he gave them was something raw, something stripped down, a kind of spiritual naivete that wasn't ignorance but choice, a willingness to be misunderstood, a decision to speak gently in a brutal room, and society didn't know what to do with that. So they did what we always do when we don't understand someone's truth. They laughed, they dismissed, they rolled their eyes and moved on. But what if that laughter is the sound of fear? Fear that someone, somewhere, is free enough to live without irony, brave enough to feel openly, human enough to hurt without hiding it. Prince Myshkin walks into a society powered by reputation and self-interest. And instead of competing, he listens. Instead of judging, he forgives. Instead of protecting himself, he opens himself completely. And for that, he is called a fool. They don't trust him. They poke him, test him, try to trap him. And when he doesn't respond like they expect, they decide he's broken. But what if he's not broken? What if he's just whole? We have been trained to see sincerity as weakness, to see openness as danger. But what if that's the lie? What if the real danger is closing ourselves off so tightly that we forget how to feel? The clown saw the fire, but no one listened because they didn't believe someone in face paint could be right. Myshkin saw the emptiness and all the cleverness around him, but no one listened because they didn't believe someone that good could be real. And maybe right now, there's someone in your life like that. Someone who doesn't fit the part. Someone who seems too gentle, too soft, too slow to get it. Maybe you've laughed. Maybe you've looked away. Maybe you've assumed they're the fool. But maybe they're the only one who hasn't fallen asleep. Because sometimes truth wears a costume. Sometimes wisdom stammers. Sometimes salvation sounds ridiculous. And when that happens, we don't recognize it. Not because it's wrong, but because we're not ready for it. That's what Dostoevsky knew. The fool doesn't need to be believed. He just needs to keep telling the truth, even while the world burns. Imagine standing in front of everything the world says you should want. Status, power, control, recognition. Now imagine turning your back on all of it, not out of bitterness, but because your heart simply isn't interested. That's Ivan the Fool. Tolstoy's simple-hearted peasant who lives with joy, gives without hesitation, and doesn't flinch when the devil himself tries to tempt him. Not because Ivan is clever, but because he's free. Dostoevsky didn't write that story, but he understood that spirit better than anyone. The kind of spirit that doesn't just reject the world's game, it forgets it even exists. Not in ignorance, but in devotion. A fool, yes, but a fool who lives in alignment with something eternal. Because the truth is, you can't tempt someone who doesn't want what you're offering. That's why Myshkin frightens the people around him. They don't understand what he's playing for. He doesn't want status. He doesn't scheme for control. He doesn't manipulate, even when it would protect him. He just is. And that in a society built on masks is terrifying. We don't know what to do with someone who doesn't want anything from us. We're used to negotiations. We're used to performance. But Myshkin shows up without a mask. And we don't know how to look at that without flinching. because it reminds us of who we were before the masks. That's the great reversal Dostoevsky reveals again and again. The fool isn't the one who understands the least. He's the one who remembers the most. He remembers that love matters more than being right, that peace matters more than winning, that silence can speak more truth than cleverness ever could. He remembers what we forgot the moment we started performing. Dostoevsky's fools aren't failed thinkers. They're spiritual rebels. They refuse to trade their souls for a seat at the table. They'd rather stand outside in the cold with open hands than sit warm among the calculating and clever. Because they know something else, that true strength is not measured by how much you can take, but by how much you can give without needing to be repaid. This is foolishness as a form of spiritual clarity, a refusal to be consumed by the appetites that make us smaller, meaner, harder. It's a declaration, silent but unwavering, that to live without deception is worth the cost, and the cost is high. The world doesn't reward this kind of fool. But Dostoevsky never promised reward. He promised that if you live like this, like Myshkin, like Ivan, like Zosima, you will be misunderstood. You will be lonely. You will be hurt. But you will not be lost. Because to want nothing from the world is to finally be free from its grip. And freedom, real freedom, has always looked a little strange. We picture the wise as untouchable, calm, controlled, a voice above the noise. But Dostoevsky didn't believe in pedestals. His wise men lived in the noise, felt the pain, fell apart. And somehow through all of that, they saw something most of us miss. In the Brothers Karamazov, he gave us Father Zosima, a monk who kissed the earth and blessed strangers, who spoke softly and forgave quickly, who didn't argue but listened. People called him a saint. Others called him senile. Dostoevsky never clarified which. He just let him be. That's the trick. Wisdom doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it limps, sometimes it trembles as it speaks. But there's a reason Dostoevsky kept returning to this image. The man who chooses humility, not because he has no choice, but because he knows it's the only way not to lose his soul. Because when you strip away the titles, the intellect, the performance, what's left? That's where real wisdom begins. Not with mastery, but with surrender. Not with certainty, but with reverence. Not with brilliance, but with softness. And that softness is exactly what makes the fool dangerous. In a world that's hardened itself for survival, softness is a rebellion, a revolution in plain sight. Dostoevsky's fools carry a kind of moral X-ray. They expose what's broken just by being whole. They walk into a room and without meaning to, remind everyone of the things they've compromised. Their presence alone is unsettling. Not because they judge, but because they don't. Not because they're loud, but because they're not playing the same game. And this is where the mask slips. Those who mock the fool the loudest often fear him the most. Because he reveals the truth no one wants to face, that we've built our lives around things that don't matter, and we've abandoned the very things that do. Dostoevsky wasn't subtle about it. He didn't try to smuggle the message in. He placed it right in the middle of his stories. The one who suffers, the one who forgives, the one who looks foolish, is the one who understands. Not in a clever way, in a sacred way. Zosima says, "Love all God's creation. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light." And people laugh. But only because they've forgotten what love feels like when it's not earned, bought, or weaponized. The fool doesn't forget. The fool remembers. And in that remembrance is a kind of strength we don't recognize anymore. A kind of wisdom we stop teaching. A kind of clarity that doesn't come from standing above the world, but from kneeling within it. Because maybe the greatest wisdom isn't knowing more. Maybe it's needing less. Defending less, judging less. Maybe it's just being present enough to love without condition, even when it costs you everything. Especially then. There's a kind of despair that wears a perfect disguise. It looks like success. It sounds like applause. It feels like safety. But underneath it all, something is missing. And deep down, we know what it is. Because we weren't born clever. We weren't born guarded. We were born open, soft, reaching for love without shame. We only learned to perform. We only learned to hide. And that learning, what we called growing up, might have been the real tragedy. Dostoevsky never begged us to become fools. He simply asked us to notice the price of not being one, to notice the exhaustion that comes with pretending, to notice the loneliness that comes with winning, to notice the ache that never goes away, even when we've done everything right. He gave us characters who weren't trying to be impressive. They were trying to be whole. They failed. They broke. But they kept loving anyway. That's what the fool does. He walks into the storm and doesn't flinch. He chooses compassion even when it makes him look weak. He tells the truth even when no one listens. He forgives before anyone says sorry. He weeps in public. He smiles when others sneer. He gives what he can without asking what he'll get. And when the world mocks him, he grieves. But he doesn't stop. Because being misunderstood isn't the worst fate. Losing your capacity to love is. That's what Dostoevsky meant when he wrote about foolishness. He wasn't talking about stupidity. He was talking about a soul brave enough to stay soft, a heart clear enough to remain open. He saw that the world would always call this madness. And still, he wrote it anyway, because he knew the truth. The fool isn't someone who doesn't understand the world. The fool is someone who refuses to become like it. So be a fool. Not because you're weak, but because you've remembered something the world forgot, and you're not letting it go. Not now. Not ever.